You're listening to the Information Security and Ocean Podcast, episode 39, originally released on January 7th, 2021. As always, I'm your host, Josh Amishav. Today we have Josh Sokol on the show. Josh is the founder and CEO of Simple Risk, which is an open source risk management solution. In a previous life, he created the information security program at National Instruments, so he knows a thing or two about risk management. My three main takeaways from our conversation were: one, which factors an organization should take into consideration when prioritizing risk; two, the different levels of maturity within a risk management program; and three, Josh's process for ensuring his code base is secure. You'll enjoy those three things plus a bunch of other tips along the way. Direct support for this podcast comes from BreachSense. Stolen credentials are one of the most common methods used to hack into a company's network. BreachSense gives you visibility into third-party data breaches, which include your company's credentials. This enables your security team to reset stolen passwords before they're used to access your sensitive data. Head on over to breachsense.io/contact to start your free 7-day trial. And now here's my conversation with Josh. Josh Sokol, welcome to the show.
Hey Josh, how's it going? Thanks for
Good,
having
it's
me.
great. Yeah, thanks for coming on. It's great to have you. So I want to talk a bit about risk management. Can you tell us what it is?
In general, risk management is just the process of understanding the different things that could cause pain in your environment, the different issues that could cause you to lose money, lose time, lose resources. And it's all about how do we effectively prioritize those things against each other and figure out what we're going to do in order to fix them and lower the overall risk to our organization.
So one of the things you mentioned before we were talking, I asked you what your contrarian view is, and I think your response was that it all comes down to risk management. Why is that? Why is it so important?
I don't know if it's necessarily a contrarian view, right? But one of the things that I've learned over the years is that pretty much everything that we do as security practitioners comes down to risk. You think about the traditional roles of the information security program, and you're doing things like application security, business continuity, disaster recovery, infrastructure security. All these things are just different ways that we manage risk. And so, as a business, your organization is looking at all these risks that are out there, and you have to have some means to say, this is more important than this. Because ultimately, businesses don't have unlimited resources. We don't have unlimited money. So we have to be able to figure out what thing is the higher priority. What's the thing that we focus our time and our money on? Risk management becomes that activity. So while it's not necessarily contrarian, the realization that I've had is that all these different activities, everything that I'm working on, if I use risk management as that kind of center point, the piece that holds it all together, I'm able to figure out what are the things that are more meaningful. Where do I put my time, my effort, or my employees' time and effort into?
So let's drill down a bit about into how to handle that risk. What are the various ways you can, as an organization, can deal with the risk?
Yeah, for a organization, you typically have a decision to make, right? When you identify a risk, the first thing is making sure that you assess that risk properly, making sure that you understand what the risk is and how it's going to impact your organization. Once you've assessed that risk, the next step is making sure that you convey that risk, meaning that management is aware of the risk, they understand that this issue exists, because it's only through that process that they can make informed decisions about how to address the risk. Now, once it comes to what are we going to do about this thing, you got a lot of different options on the table. The first one is you can accept the risk. You can say, I'm going to do nothing about this risk. I understand that's there. I understand that's a valid risk, but there really isn't anything that I necessarily can do to address this. Or maybe the risk is at what we would say an acceptable level or an acceptable appetite of risk, in which case you can just say, hey, we're cool with the amount of risk that we have for us right now. One of the other options is you can mitigate that risk. You can say, this is an important risk. This is something that we don't want to see in our environment. It's not an acceptable level. And therefore, we're going to do something about it. We're actually going to choose to fix this particular risk. And so every mitigation is going to be different depending on what the actual risk is. But your mitigation is how are we going to actually fix this? And it may not even be a full mitigation, it might be a partial mitigation. Uh, the one of the other pieces that you can do is you can transfer that risk. You can say, this is an important risk. I'm not going to necessarily do anything to mitigate it myself, but there are other people that I can push this risk off to. And I'll give you an example. When I ran the security program at National Instruments, we were looking at PCI, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. And what we realized is we had these credit cards that were in our environment, and that was in and of itself a risk, the risk of a data breach, the risk of that information getting out there, which can affect your organization all sorts of different ways. And we had a couple of options on the table. We could try and make our entire credit card processing environment PCI compliant, in which case we would be basically be mitigating that risk. Or the other option was we can transfer that risk. And what we ended up doing was we did what's called tokenization. We turned all the credit cards in our environment into tokens. And the way that we did that is we leveraged a third party provider. That third party provider basically took in all the credit card data. It turned it into this token, which was not associated with that credit card, but it was a unique reference to it. And then we stored those tokens in our environment. So the risk of having credit cards still existed. Every single one of our customers, everyone who processed credit cards was still there. We just transferred that risk over to a third party. They now had that liability associated with that. If we got breached, it was tokens. It's not a big deal. Another good example of transferring risk is cybersecurity insurance, right? The risk of the data breach is still there, but you're transferring at least some of that liability for that data breach onto a third party, in this case, the insurance company. So those are typically going to be the things that you're going to do when it comes to risk mitigation. There's other things that you could do, like researching it or whatnot, if you're not ready to actually make a decision on it. But those three activities tend to be kind of the standard ones that we look at when it comes to risk mitigation.
Let's say you're deciding to mitigate a risk. Is there like, say, a list of things that you should look at to help you make that decision? Meaning things like if there's a public exploit or other things that should be taken into consideration. They say, okay, if 1, 2, and 3 hit, then we're going to fix this film.
Yeah, what you're kind of hinting at is like a risk scoring methodology. And there's lots of different methodologies that are out there for scoring risk. And methodologies tend to be, they cater differently to different types of risk. So, for example, you and I both have kind of an OWASP background. OWASP actually has a risk assessment methodology. And the OWASP risk assessment methodology is really good at rating application security risks, and it breaks it down into things like a business impact and a technical impact, and it talks about what those impacts actually mean across the organization. You may see things like a blue keep vulnerability. That was a relatively recent one. The blue keep vulnerability, they use a CVE, and they use CVSS scoring, common vulnerability scoring system. And with CVSS, very similarly, they're going to break it down, but they're going to break down the technical pieces of the vulnerability, things like how easy is it to exploit it? Is there a patch for this particular issue? And then they're also going to break it down into the impact to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so all these different pieces kind of come into play when we're scoring risk, and every risk is going to be a little bit different. You may get super, super simple and say, I'm just going to take a likelihood value and an impact value. How likely it is for this thing to happen? What's the impact if it does happen? It might be as simple as that, or you can get super complex and start looking at things like CVSS scoring, and then there's kind of anywhere in the middle there.
Okay, then you brought up CVSS, and I guess one of my pet peeves with that is that it's very subjective
Hmm.
when you're doing the scoring, and when if you're making a decision based on a subjective scoring system, it'd be very easy to manipulate scores to push certain things to get fixed and others not to. So how can an organization prevent that from happening?
Yeah, it's interesting because we actually run a private bug bounty program at Simple Risk, and one of the things that these bounty people, these hackers, will use is CVSS scoring in order to rate the vulnerability. And to your point, one of the common things that we find is they get paid more for the higher severity of the issue, and so they tend to kind of stack the deck in their favor, right? Of course, this is remotely exploitable, and of course, this is increased permission and whatever. And every time you notch that up a little bit, it tweaks the score, it makes it higher. It absolutely is subjective. And the reality is it it all comes down to the organization. You have to look through it through this kind of organizational lens. What does this risk mean for our environment, for our systems, for the impact of this thing? And it's almost one of the beauties of CVSS, right? If you look at the base vector, the base scoring vector for CVSS scoring, it's all about the vulnerability itself. It's about the how exploitable that vulnerability is, and is there a patch for this vulnerability and things like that. When you look at the other things, there's a temporal metric. The temporal piece is kind of looking at how the risk is changing over time. So, for example, when Bluekeep was a 0 day, the risk was very, very high. When Microsoft issued a patch for it, the risk now went down, right? And so you're able to look at things like that. The other component that goes into there is the environmental component. And environmental is all about your organization, how this is this one system that's affected? Is it every system that's affected? Those kind of things. And so while CVSS, yeah, it is kind of subjective, meaning the person that's like, selecting the drop downs or whatever, they're the ones making those decisions. I think it actually probably gets closest out of almost any scoring methodology that I've seen to actually being an objective score, versus something like classic risk, what we learned on our CISSP, risk is likelihood times impact, right? What's the likelihood of a train derailing and taking our data set? You know, I don't know. I have no idea. What's the impact if it does it? Wow, that would be catastrophic. I don't know, right? So there's I think that CVSS actually is probably one of the least subjective. I'm not saying that's not, right. That there is still a person behind there, but it's probably one of the least subjective scoring methodologies out there.
Interesting. Does the size of the organization influence the way where the company should focus its efforts? Like, for example, if you're talking about a smaller company, should they should they approach this completely different than a medium or large organization?
Um, so I don't know if the approach is different, kind of overall, but yes, every organization is going to manage risk differently. So one of the things, since I started Simplest, I've worked with organizations that are massive organizations in those Fortune 100s, and I've worked with organizations that are, a handful of people, less than 10 people in the entire organization. And there's a lot of common threads there. There's a lot of, risk management is a very basic process. You look at the risks in your environment, you create a registry of those risks, you decide how you're going to fix it, and then you make sure that management is involved in that process and you're re-reviewing risk on a regular basis. Those are kind of the common thread across everybody. But one of the things that we typically see is there are layers of maturity within risk management. And what I mean by that is organizations that get a solid grasp on those kind of fundamentals, they look at how do we evolve? How do we move from this, kind of qualitative risk assessment into quantitative realms? How do we figure out that the cost of this particular risk is actually $1 million? And so, oftentimes that's to do with the assets that are involved. This particular risk is spread across these assets. Those assets are worth this much money. Therefore, if this risk happens, this is the impact of that particular risk. And so, oftentimes what we see is organizations aren't going to differ in those fundamentals, the basics. They're going to differ in terms of maturity, in terms of those evolutions. Are they going to bring assets into risk? Are they going to start to do vendor risk assessments or third party risk assessments? Those are usually the areas where we start to see differences across the organizations.
Okay, so you mentioned simpler risk. Can you tell us what that is?
Absolutely. So Simperse is my business. I'm the CEO and founder, and it's got kind of an interesting backstory. So I mentioned before, I was the information security program owner for a big $1.6 billion a year enterprise called National Instruments. And when I first started, I was a team of one. It was just me running the entire program. And my VP came to me one day and she said, "Josh, I heard about this risk management thing. I'd like you to look into it." I said, "All right, that sounds cool. Sure, I'll look at it." I did a lot of research. I tried to figure out what risk management meant. I came across the NIST 800-30 framework. I said, all right, this makes sense to me. Uh, but the piece I really struggled with was the tool set. How do I actually put the NIST framework into action? And when I was struggling, I actually started out using an Excel spreadsheet. Quickly realized that wasn't going to scale for me. I actually used the Lotus Notes database for a little bit, and every time I needed to make a change, it took 6 months for a Notes admin to make changes. And then eventually I started looking at the big GRC suites out there. GRC is governance, risk, and compliance. And I looked at a tool, I looked at a bunch of tools. I kind of settled on CA because it seemed to have basically the things that I would want. And I ended up going to my VP. I said, ma'am, you asked me to look into this whole risk management thing. Here's what I learned. Here's risk management in a nutshell. And I put a piece of paper on her desk and I said, and this is the tool that's going to get us there. And she looked at the $500,000 price tag and she laughed at me. She said, Josh, your budget is $0. Go figure it out. And so, I was kind of stuck between this rock and a hard place. I can't, Excel isn't going to work. It's not going to scale for me. And the majority of people out there are still using Excel for risk management. Uh, I couldn't afford the big GRC tool. And so I ended up writing one. I took about a month. I wrote this tool that was basically a page to submit a risk, a page that was to view the risk that I just submitted, and then a page that listed all the risks in the system. And I wrote it in PHP. I had a MySQL database backend, so all kind of open source technologies. And I ended up giving a talk at the B-Sides Austin conference back in March of 2013. Talked about risk management, talked about everything that I'd learned. And then at the end of the talk, I always hate it when you go to these security conferences and people walk in and they're like, here's a problem. And then they mic drop and walk away. I wanted to leave people with a solution. And so I took this application that I wrote that was helping me, and I released it free and open source. It was under the Mozilla public license, so basically people could use it, download it, do whatever the heck they wanted with it. And a really cool thing happened. People started coming to me and saying, "Hey, Josh, this tool is useful. Can you make it integrate with Active Directory? Can you make it send emails? Can you do risk assessments? Can you host it for me? Can I pay you for support?" And so this business of Simplerish actually grew out of this free open source thing. And it's funny, I'm married. My wife and I have been together for a long time. My wife, when she found out that I was going to be giving this thing away, she was mad at me. She was like, "What are you doing? Like you're spending all this time away from me, away from the kids, writing this tool, and you're just giving it away." And I was like, "Well, I kind of believe in karma, right? You put good things out there, good things come back to you." Well, people started paying me for all these different things, the extra functionality, the support, um, and the business of Simplerish actually grew out of that open source product. So today we're not a massive company. We're no Archer. To be honest with you, I don't want to be an Archer. But we have a product that covers all the governance, the risk management, the compliance, and we actually call it Simplerish Core. It's free. It's open source. You can download and use it at simplerish.com. And then on top of that, we sell what we call extras. Extras are plug and play modules that give you additional features and functionality above and beyond kind of that core piece. And then we'll also do hosting and stuff. If you don't want to manage your own system, we can take care of that for you. So that's basically what Simplerish is.
That's a great story. Do you have any? I don't know if you have any visibility into this. But do you have any visibility into remediation on the cloud hosted service?
What do you mean by remediation?
Like, it'd just be interesting from your standpoint to say, okay, these are the vulnerabilities that we see, and these are the ones that are getting fixed. And
Mhm.
this is it takes, let's say, I would be interested in when an ODay or when an publicly available exploit comes out, it'll take 3 months on average to get fixed. And when there's not, it takes, I don't know, 12, or like some stats around remediation. If you have any visibility into that, it could be, and it's not relevant.
Yeah, I mean, there are metrics in the system, right? You can track things like time from a risk was open to time it was closed. So I think that you can get to those details. I think probably the more interesting stuff is around like the inherent risk versus residual risk and things like that. So inherent risk being what is the kind of overall risk of this particular issue, this vulnerability or whatever, and the residual risk being after we apply our mitigation, how much risk is left over. So you and I met, doing mod security stuff back in the day. With that, mod security is a web application firewall, and I can apply a WAF to a particular vulnerability. We'll say SQL injection, and that helps. But we both know that's not foolproof, right? There are ways to bypass a WAF. There may be other vulnerabilities that we don't understand, and so we're never going to get rid, at least in that situation, of 100% of the risk. And so tracking things like when I apply this WAF as a mitigation for this particular risk, uh, I'm not doing 100% mitigation. I'm doing a 80% mitigation or 90% mitigation. Just throwing arbitrary numbers out there, but understanding that while we're reducing the risk, we're not reducing it to zero. And so when it comes to risk management in general, you kind of have to look at the big picture, right? What are the big risks that are out there? What are the things that we've mitigated to an acceptable level? Where do we invest our time? Where do we invest our money? And so that really is kind of the crux of it. It's not necessarily about the time to remediation. It's more about understanding that we have vulnerabilities that are out there, risks that are out there that are unmitigated or that are still outside of our level of corporate appetite for risk.
Okay, then measuring that. Let me ask you. You mentioned before you brought up managing vendor risk.
Mhm.
How do you do that?
So different organizations do it in different ways. In terms of the kind of simplest philosophy, we always focus on those first six letters of our name. Simple. How do we make this as easy as possible? And so what we've done is we've created a risk assessment extra. It's one of those plug and play modules, but it gives you the ability to basically create questions, create questionnaires, send those out, collect the answers back. You can map it to compliance, so you can map it to your control frameworks and things like that. You can actually turn the results into risk, and so we kind of view that as the easy way to kind of do these assessments.
Just go
Other,
with a template?
yeah, I mean, you can create templates and things like that. One of the challenges that we do run into though is there's some great templates that are already out there. For example,
Okay.
CSA has their star stuff. SIG is a great one as well. There are some really good ones out there. The big challenge that we run into is it's proprietary for the most part. CSA and SIG are both proprietary, and what that means is they won't let us just give it to you, but if you want to build it in the tool, you can do that. So it becomes a little bit tricky, removing the liability from us, but it absolutely can be done. And actually, one of my coolest moments, doing the simplest thing was when I had one of our customers send me a risk assessment, a third party risk assessment using Simplest as the tool to send the assessment. It doesn't get any cooler than that. So, as I'm clicking through and filling out the answers, I'm just, big grin on my face the entire time.
So when you're developing a security tool, coming from a security background, what kind of testing or precautions, what do you do during the development to ensure that you're not opening up new risks to your clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole secure development life cycle, right? It's all about kind of start to finish, understanding that security matters. And with me kind of coming from that background, I did the OWASP thing. I ran the security team at National Instruments. For me, this isn't just another application. This is my reputation that's on the line with this. And so, it starts with the people that I hire. When I hire a developer, I'm not just hiring any developer to work on the tool. I'm hiring developers that could prove to me that they knew application security. And I actually gave each of our developers a quiz to start off with. I gave them a very simple web page, and I basically gave them the PHP code, and I said, "What's wrong with this?" And it was interesting because I had a ton of developers that were like, "You don't have any CSS. There's no style sheets there," or your HTML is blah blah blah. There was like a handful, and when I say handful, I'm talking about maybe 1% of the developers that would respond that would say, "Oh, you've got a cross-site scripting vulnerability in there. You're echoing the data back into the page content." right? That it starts there because they at least understand that there's a fundamental issue there. Once you have those right people, then it comes down to training. How do we make sure that they understand, cross-site scripting isn't the only vulnerability in there. It's a popular one, but it's not the only thing. So, going and making sure that they're trained on things like the OWASP top 10, stuff like that. And then from there, it comes down to, are we properly scanning, right? Because our developers aren't perfect. I'm not perfect. I actually wrote a blog post a while back saying that there was a cross-site scripting vulnerability in almost every PHP I had written. And this predates Simpleriss, but I realized that there was an issue with how I was handling form posts in PHP, going back to my days of like web design and stuff like that. So just understanding that. Uh, that people are fallible and you sometimes need to use things like stack analysis, dynamic analysis tools in order to scan that. Right now, to be honest with you, that process is pretty manual. But we're actually, I hired, my last hire was a DevSecOps engineer who's helping us to transition into automated build pipelines, making sure that everything happens on an automated fashion so that we have near instantaneous feedback. When a developer checks code in, they get an email that says, here's the vulnerabilities in the code that you just checked in. And then when it comes to the production deployments, it's all about making sure that we're validating that information. So we review each other's code, we look for issues. We also have a private bug bounty program with HackerOne. So we have people that are actively testing on this, finding vulnerabilities, reporting them back to us. Kind of validating that whole process. And there's other pieces that kind of fit into there. How do we secure our infrastructure, things like that. But when it comes to application development, I think those are kind of the key pieces in there.
Definitely. So, do you have any advice for somebody who wants to do something similar and start a security company?
Yeah. I mean, so being a techie that I am, I'm not an entrepreneur per se, or at least not your traditional entrepreneur. I'm the guy who saw a problem and said, "Hey, I have a solution to this," or "I think I can help with this." I think that oftentimes it starts with that, understanding that here's a problem and it's something that you can be passionate about. It's something that you feel like you have a solution to. Once you do that, it's all about kind of how you market it. How do you put that out there? And I told you my story earlier about the open source piece. For us, that's kind of been fundamental. When I look at the risk management space, it's Excel on one side of things, and it's half a million plus dollar GRC solutions on the other end of things, and there was no middle ground. So for me, it's like if I can do everything that Excel does and do it better, I mean, Excel is my competition, right? And so, I think understanding that, understanding the space, you don't want to go in and compete with Archer. You want to be the anti-Archer. You want to say that Archer is. I mean, you don't even have to say it. Everybody knows it. Archer is so complex. It's so bloated. It's so expensive. You want to be the anti-Archer. You want to go into this and say, we're easy, we're intuitive, we're cost effective. For me, that's really the messaging that I wanted to do. So kind of understanding where you fit in that market and how are people going to perceive you. um, I think that for me was really the big thing. And I mentioned earlier, we're still very very true to that kind of open source roots. We want to make sure that everybody out there has something that's better than spreadsheets. And then I think that really comes down to ultimately the culture. You want to instill this vibe, or you're doing it because you love it. You do it because you're passionate about it. You do it because it interests you and you want to help people. At the end of the day, you're not going to go wrong if that's your motivation for doing things, and everybody is going to kind of sense that from you. If you go into it with the idea that, hey, I'm going to start a business because I'm going to make a lot of money and get chicks and whatever, like, you know, it's it's not authentic. It People will see right through you, and it just doesn't have that same effect.
Did the you mentioned marketing? Did the open source component of it, was that a big factor in the marketing in the early days? Like what made Simple Risk take off?
I do think that the open source component is a big factor. I would warn that anybody who thinks that that making a product open source means that you're going to get a ton of free development, that's not the case, right? You know that from mod security, right? It's a few core people that are doing all of the work. And that absolutely was the case with SimpleRisk. But I think that people look at open source differently. It certainly helps when it comes to other areas of the world where cost is a much bigger factor. It certainly helps in terms of evangelization. For example, I've presented at the Black Hat Arsenal year after year after year because I am an open source tool, because I have something where I can show, this is free, you can download it, you can use it, it's better than spreadsheets, that kind of messaging. You know, you compare that to how much it would actually cost to have a booth at Black Hat. It's amazing. So I think that there are definite advantages to being open source. It may not be the kind of things that we think of, but just being able to kind of put yourself out there and say, "Hey," I mean, to be honest with you, the fact that I'm even talking to you right now, a lot of podcasts will charge people massive amounts of money to sponsor their podcast just to sit down and talk with them, right? I can at least tell you, like, I have a free thing that people can download. I can tell you that my history is actually being a practitioner, not being the douchey sales guy. I think that those are really the things that help more than anything else.
Cool. Now, on the practitioner side, do you have any? What resources would you suggest of somebody who is just getting into the field? What would you suggest?
Um, so I mentioned I'm an OWASP guy. I've been doing OWASP for a very, very long time. And so for anybody who's just getting in, OWASP is a fantastic organization. It has an amazing number of resources, and all of them are free. And so, if you can get involved with OWASP, there's chapters literally all over the world. The website has all sorts of good content. Get to know the community, right? There's tons of really amazing people that are super outgoing and super willing to help and teach and things like that. Um, that's easily my number one place to start. I would say never stop learning. Always reading books and doing capture the flags and things like that. Always trying to expand your mind. I think that's good. And ultimately,
What's your top book recommendations?
top book, man. So I'm gonna go old school, and Michael Howard is a friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. He wrote a book, basically, are securing the SDLC or SDLC security, something like that. Michael Howard. That is probably my go-to, basically because that book is kind of the start to finish. How do you look at a software development life cycle? Where do you insert different pieces? It was written a long time ago, so it's less about agile, more about waterfall development methodologies, but the practices are still very sound in it. The idea that you should be training your developers and the idea that you should be involving the business in these decisions and things like that still rings very, very true to me. That would probably be my top one, even though it's kind of an older book. If you're looking for something to geek out to, um, Kevin Mitnick had a book that was, I think it's The Art of Deception, and I I I find steganography fascinating. I did talks about 5 years ago or something like that. Um, just knowing how people are hiding data in different ways is just incredibly fascinating. And so that one's one. If you're looking for something that's just kind of like, whoa, I didn't realize that. That's a fun book. Absolutely. So yeah,
Cool. All right, I thought you were going to say the web application hackers handbook, but
honestly,
that could be if you come from like a pen testing background. Sorry, what were you saying?
yeah, I was gonna say I've read that one. We actually did that one in our OWASP study group that we do here in Austin, and it's a good book, but it really is. It's focused so heavily on application security, and like specific issues. And then there's a kind of counter one that's the Web Application Defender's Handbook. That's like basically a mod security manual. Um,
Yeah.
they're great books, but when it comes to I, I don't know. I think the other ones are just better when it comes to a newbie looking at the process.
Cool. All right. Where could people find you?
So simplerist.com is our website. I do some blogging on there. There's a bunch of posts. I've done some cool stuff with security, the NIST CSF cybersecurity framework and kind of maturity models around that, and some other stuff. I do have another site. I haven't blogged in a long time, but there's some cool older stuff. Some stuff following like some of the CTFs that I've done called webadminblog.com. And then if you want to find me on Twitter, I'm at Josh Sokol, JoshSokol.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much for coming on the show. This has been great.
Absolutely. It's great to catch up with you, Josh. I appreciate the opportunity, and hopefully we'll get to do some more soon.
All right, that's it for this week. If you have any feedback or questions, you can tweet at me at Jamoose. And if you got value from this episode, then please share it with a friend. See y'all next week.